Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplanty Goodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion, which you might be able to see around me. It's tropical houseplants. Now today's video I want to talk a bit about a plant that I got as a cutting from a very dear friend, and lo and behold I didn't know that this plant was going to be as much of a vigorous grower as it is. I should have guessed because it is Monstera, but let me show you the plant that I'm talking about. So you might be able to see the plant in front of me, and I will pan it up. Sorry, I keep looking up because again, ceiling fan. I'm going to end up chopping one of these tall plants one of these days. It's just going to happen, I know. But let me bring it in a bit closer, and hopefully that will focus on the plant instead of me. But you might be able to see, if I pan it down, you can see that there is different morphological changes that happen to the leaves as they grow larger and they mature and they grow upwards. So let's talk about this. Firstly, this plant is a Monstera siltepecana, and not a plant that I ever had in my collection. I kept seeing it around, I never picked one up, so really glad that I ended up getting a cutting from a friend. And interestingly enough, another friend then sent me another cutting with slightly more mature leaves, which are probably about the size of these. And to be fair, that had the more mature leaves, this had the more juvenile leaves. In order to go from the juvenile leaves to the mature leaves on this plant, it only took about a month. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how vigorous of a grower this is. Granted, there are also a lot of very, very long, and you can see it there, aerial roots. So I will be chopping this up and propagating it just to get a fuller plant, because it is a viner, and at the moment I've only got the one vine in this plant. In the other cutting that I had, because it was growing quite tall and I had to chop it up just because it was starting to hit the ceiling, I have since repotted the other cutting straight into the same soil, and it's now rooting out, and eventually it will start pushing out new stems. But talking about the morphology, and we were talking before about the more juvenile leaves. The more juvenile leaves tend to be very silvery. They have this silvery cast, and as you can see, the larger the leaves get, the less silver is on those leaves. And you can see some of these are almost entirely green. There's some lighter shades of green. There's maybe a tiny bit of the silvery left, but not that much. I don't know whether or not some of the stippling is being picked up on this plant. I have got it maybe in too bright of a light, but I'm okay with that. It doesn't seem to be harming the plant. If anything, the leaves are getting larger, because as with most Monstera, you need to remember that they start off quite juvenile leaved and much smaller, and a lot of them in a different form, because when they're growing in the wild, they're growing along, usually a cutting or something like that might be growing along the soil line of the forest, and then it will hit a tree and it will start climbing. And as it goes further up the tree, which is the reason why they have these very, very long and substantial aerial roots, is because they attach onto the trunk of the tree. And the higher up they get towards the forest canopy, and there's more light there, the larger the leaves are. And also, the other thing that a lot of people do tend to forget sometimes is the reason why they get these larger leaves is because these aerial roots are attaching onto the tree trunk. Because you'd imagine a plant genetically knows that if it's got huge leaves and it's right at the top and it's got nothing to attach it to the tree, and it can flop and snap, it won't produce large leaves because it's too risky for its own kind of life, essentially, for its own continuation. So what it will do, the moment that it starts pushing out these aerial roots and it starts attaching to something, is the moment that you'll start seeing some of these larger leaves. Which is another reason why I'm always a bit hesitant when people say, especially with the Monsteras, and I get it, it's cumbersome and you get a lot of aerial roots, and eventually if you've got fully mature leaves, especially with the Deliciosas or even the Alba Brazilianas, that people might want to chop off the aerial roots, because otherwise you end up with a lot of roots just hanging around and attaching themselves to things, especially the aerial roots. And I'm looking currently at my Monstera albo, and I've got a whole bunch of aerial roots just sitting in a bag, because I have actually found with a lot of the Monstera specifically that if you don't chop off the aerial roots, doesn't matter what Monstera it is, it's faster for them to go to the slightly more mature leaves. As I said with the Albo and the Deliciosa, if you've got a mature enough leaf and you're comfortable with where it is and you don't want it to get any bigger, start chopping back some of those aerial roots, especially some of the older aerial roots. It's not going to cause as much of a problem, and I know it can be a bit of a tricky thing to have around, but just a tip of things that I've seen in my experience, at least. You might disagree. If you do drop a comment down below and let me know what your different experiences are, basically. But overall, really, really simple plant to take care of. As with most monsteras, I've got it in a terracotta pot. I've got it in my light, airy, aroid soil mix. I will water when it gets on the drier side. This is one of my plants. If it's a monstera, I don't mind it going fully dry. There are some exceptions, obviously, things like the shingling monsteras and Monstera dubia, but even that probably does go quite dry before I water it. And yeah, as long as you're giving it bright and direct light, if it starts heading upwards and you've got something like a skylight, I've got the conservatory roof obviously at the top, and it's reaching brighter light to that point, you will start seeing more mature leaves. And again, it's replicating what it would do in nature. So as long as you're giving it something to support itself, then you should be fine. In terms of pest pressure with this, I don't think I have had many pests on this. Maybe some mealybugs, but I'm generally struggling with mealybugs in this conservatory a lot. So I don't know whether or not it's because this plant is more susceptible to them or just because it's in its environment, but so far so good. In terms of watering, again, I will use my plant care reminder app and my moisture meter, but generally in my environment at the moment, this is getting watered every 4 or 5 days. But again, it's been summer here. That's in my environment. There's high humidity. It's in a very small pot. It's in a terracotta pot. It's in a very light, airy soil mix. Your conditions might be different. So I always encourage you to check. Definitely invest in a moisture meter. It's not going to cost you that much, especially if you're starting to go for slightly more expensive plants. The question then becomes if you're spending triple figures to buy a plant that you really want, why are you hesitating on a single figure moisture meter on something like Amazon, which might just mean that you can care for those really, really expensive plants a bit better, basically, so that you don't run the risk of things like root rot. So that's my little rant out the way. If you haven't already, just get yourself a moisture meter. If you're looking for a decent one, I think I've got one listed down below in the description, but that's just the one I'm using. You can find loads of them on Amazon. Feel free to shop around. But yeah, I think overall, I have to say, maybe this might be the easiest monstera I have and the most reliable so far. Even more so than the Deliciosa, even more so than the Thai constellation, the Albos. This one just keeps on keeping on, really. And from people that I've spoken to, the 2 people that I've got these cuttings from, they pretty much said the same thing. They grow like a weed. So if you want a nice, easy, slightly more uncommon monstera, definitely try the Monstera silsipicana. I don't think you'll go wrong. Now, I think that's everything I wanted to say about this. If you've got any questions or comments, as always, do drop them down below. I'd love to have that conversation with you. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.